All right, listen. So I'm looking at chapters 13, I'm looking at chapters 14, and they got me pissed off. Not because I don't like what's happening in there, not because I'm not learning a lot per usual, but because it's just a jumble. This is one of those times when it would be great if Lacan just slowed down, lined things up, invoked his previous work, showed how what he was doing now is different from that. That ain't how his brain works. Maybe that's not how his notes work, but it's how we try and work. So let's see if we can make some sense here of chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 15, well, if you've got there, you've seen bro is sick. He shows up with a fever, but he does say one thing in 15 that marks the turning point, that allows us, I believe, to add some crucial diagrammatic captions to what he's up to. Okay, let's start with 13. Psychoanalysis, he tells us in 13, studies unconscious knowledge about the sexual as it finds expression in drives that, oddly enough, divert from real, absolute enjoyment in service to the production of a more socially acceptable kind of satisfaction. Now, each of these words in this summary of what he's doing in 13 is, of course, a term that we could unpack and explore further. We've done a lot of that work before, but it is worth noting some of the key themes here. First, he is suggesting here that the drive can be satisfied outside of, via sublimation, its sexual goal, and apart from enjoyment. And that's interesting here. I would suggest this puts us back on the rails of surplus enjoyment. But what he's doing here is he's digging back into Freud to suggest an understanding of how the drive can be satisfied outside of enjoyment in a kind of attenuated, sublimated form. And so what we're working towards here, I would suggest, are two theories of the drive. One that we get from Lacan in Seminar 11 and the essays that attend that period. And now we've got an understanding of the drive that he's using to try and think his way towards surplus jouissance. That's the wager. I'm reading along as I deliver these lectures. I haven't read ahead, except by a chapter or two, to try and keep us on point. But check this out. The definition I just gave you about what psychoanalysis does, it also tells us something about psychoanalytic inquiry. It tells us that psychoanalytic inquiry is a critique of sorts. It moves in the genre of critique in its original Kantian sense. Psychoanalysis calls conscious knowledge into question by focusing on what, according to Lacan, is its condition of possibility, namely unconscious knowledge, specifically unconscious knowledge of the sexual. The sexual as rendered unconscious by way of prohibition and the logics of castration, the minus phi of loss and the objet a of lack that we've discussed so many times before. The sexual is a word that he's using to mark the space of the real as a result of prohibition. You can see this in chapters 13 and 14. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look. Chapter 13, page 3 through 4. These are good chapters, by the way. They're annoying, but they're good. Chapter 13, pages 3 to 4, he sets up some pretty hilarious stuff here. First, he wants everybody to know that, as he puts it on page 2 of chapter 13, who has ever learned in psychoanalysis how to treat his wife properly? He has said this elsewhere in his work too. Lacan is really keen on this. We talk a lot about sex in psychoanalysis, but very few people have ever read Freud or Lacan and learned how to be a better lover. There's not a technical aspect for sexuality provided by psychoanalysis. And that's what he says at the top of page 3. He wants to distinguish between the techniques of the body, something properly erotic that don't have anything to do with psychoanalysis, and the type of sexual knowledge that he says is tackled in psychoanalysis. Check it out, bottom of page 3, maybe 10 lines up from the bottom. The angle, then, from which sexual knowledge is tackled in psychoanalysis, knowing very clearly here that he's not talking about how to have sex, how to be a good lover, the kind of techniques of the body that he is distinguishing from psychoanalytic inquiry at the top of page 3. He says, okay, well, what kind of sexual knowledge, if it's not a kind of know-how for the bedroom, does psychoanalysis traffic in? Or in this case, tackle? The angle from which sexual knowledge is tackled in psychoanalysis is why it takes on its weight in the way that I write it. There again, once more, what is at stake is a recourse to what is obvious from the start. And this is indeed the prohibition, properly speaking, that can cover this knowledge, sexual knowledge. The angle from which I would not say we enter into it, but are confronted by it, the way that only the real can confront us, is again the following, in the sense that this angle was never taken. It is to tackle it from the point where this prohibition is brought to bear. And that is why the first statements of Freud with respect to the unconscious put the accent on the function of censorship as such. So some of you wonder why the emphasis in this series at the start of the castrative process is on the no of the father. And this is always, for Lacan, I argue, the starting point for symbolic alienation. It begins with prohibition. And it can happen at all these different stages of development. Again, if you like to play the stage game. But really, it's around language acquisition, what you might classify as the phallic stage, if you like the stage game, that Lacan intervenes. It's at the level of language acquisition, where the first word the child hears and understands, no matter what that word actually was, functioned as a no, the no of the father, a prohibition, thereby inaugurating castration, lack, and the like. We've been over this a million times, so I'm not going to spend too much time with it. I just want to point it out that he's right there with it. Chapter 13, page 3. Continuing to the top of page 4. This prohibition is exercised as affecting a certain there, that place where it speaks, where it avows itself, where it avows that it is preoccupied by the question of knowledge. You know what this there is. And admire there, in passing once again, the riches of language. And then he goes on to make this cool move with preoccupation from Besetzung. It's kind of interesting, and it just means occupation, but he wants to put a pre on the front of it, which is pretty terrific, as suggesting something with which we are occupied in advance. And what can this be? What can we be occupied with in advance? What can be meant? And this is what requires us to return to it again. To this function of, wait for it, the unconscious. What can be meant by this knowledge, whose mark at a certain level that is articulated from truth is defined by the fact that this knowledge that preoccupies you is what you know least. Prohibition conditions a certain there that is the space of the unconscious. And it's a space that is a preoccupying space. Before any occupations, there's a preoccupation that we all have with unconscious knowledge. Knowledge where we know the least, arguably about the most.